All right, everyone, welcome back to Stew and the Nunn. This is part two of our interview with Cameron Hamilton. And in fact, I'm even putting it there at the bottom. Look at the website. So part two of this, if you've seen the first part, if you haven't, go back and watch the first part where you really get to meet Cameron, get to know what he's about and where he came from. This one, we're going to talk more into some current topics and some of the things that he has signed up to pledge. And we're going to start, Cameron, right with term limits. That is something I'm a big believer in. I've talked about for years. You've put your name on the line on that. Tell our listeners, viewers, a little bit about what you've done and why you believe in that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, again, thanks for having me one more time. It's a privilege to be here. I would say, as it pertains to term limits, we've seen kind of a political class of people that sort of get elected and then stay, and then seemingly we can't get them out of office. They become so inundated with DC life, with the DC circuit, that they don't really represent the people that they're supposed to. So I signed the pledge on term limits, which means I pledge to support a constitutional amendment if brought before the House of Representatives, which would ultimately place limits on different members. There are limitations on members of the House, as well as limitations on members of the Senate. And so there would have to be a lot of negotiation on how most conversations and kind of theories about term limits pertain to 2 terms for a senator, and then possibly 6 terms as a representative. There are some that say 3 terms as a representative. There are some that say 2 and 2. That's a possibility. And so either way, what I've pledged to is that I fully would support bringing an amendment before the House of Representatives to place term limits on members of Congress as well as the Senate. How that looks is probably going to be something that would have to be further debated. But I think it's a great idea because I think the more we inundate politics in DC with people who actually live in the United States, work in their rural communities that they're supposed to represent, the better we can be. I think we need to break up some of the groupthink and some of the old hand kind of political groups and really get back to serving the people. And I think the term limits pledge is one way to do that.
Do you think this is, I mean, it seems to me that this would almost have to be some generations would have to change, right? There's a number of people, right, that maybe sit in an elected position for 40, 50 years, right? We watch them go from literally graduating college to actually president now. But either way, I mean, they die in office from old age. They don't see it as civil service as our founding fathers, envisioned this, as our first elected representatives did, right? They see it as a meal ticket versus come up, represent their constituents, and go back to their local communities. Yeah. Do you feel like a lot of that old guard, if you would have to become the big minority for this to ever happen?
It would be difficult. I don't pretend at all that it wouldn't be difficult. There'd be a lot of people who have quite a bit of influence that would fight this exceptionally with a significant amount of effort. I'll put it that way.
Yeah.
So it's an unpopular perspective as it pertains towards legislators, but it's a wonderfully popular perspective as it pertains towards the taxpayer that ultimately pays their salaries. So, look, I'm willing to have that fight. I'm willing to stand and argue on the merits of it on the House floor. And I think it would be anything that could allow the taxpayer and the voter ultimately to feel more enfranchised with how their government works, the better. Yeah. We have people now that feel exceedingly disconnected and that feel that we have representatives in power who don't really serve their interests, serve special interests or personal motives. And that's a problem. That's another one of those things that I call a grotesque imbalance. So I think term limits is a unique way to solve that problem. I also think we need higher ethics standards. We have more investigations of criminal wrongdoing into members of Congress than we do in the entire NFL. And I think most people would be shocked if they heard some of those numbers.
Yeah, we hear about ethics investigations all the time and nothing ever comes of it, right?
Exactly.
The other day, a sitting member was, finally charged with pulling a false fire alarm. We'll see what comes of it. Some people compare that to what happened on January 6th, trying to stop a political process, right? But he was charged with a misdemeanor. We'll see what comes of it, if anything. But yeah, I mean, it's granted. Okay,
another pledge that I've made very clearly is on voting to eliminate virtually all exemptions that Congress has from existing law. If Congress passes a law on a certain matter, like for example, the Obamacare Act, or the Affordable Care Act, or others,
Right.
Congress should have to pony up and should not have a carve out that would exempt them from ultimately the enforcement of that law or statute. That's ultimate. Those are parameters and things that, from a jurisprudence perspective, I will fully support. I don't think Congress should be quote unquote special. Now,
Right.
of course, that comes with a double-edged sword. Clearly, we need extra security members for members of Congress.
Right.
We've seen that. So that's a unique. Well, what the heck? Americans don't have private security. Why does Congress? Okay, well, that's just look. We gotta live in reality.
That's not
We
building a
have death
class
threats
system.
all the
Yeah.
time
Right.
against Democrats, against Republicans. That's not helpful. It doesn't do anything good if we actually allow our legislators to be assassinated. And if you saw the rally that Trump had at the White House, remember before he ran for re-election in 2020, all the people that left the White House and walked to their cars, it was some of the most abysmal, awful presentations of humanity or lack of humanity that we can see. It
Yeah.
was really just astonishing. We had Dan Bongino walked out with his wife. People were threatening to literally cut his head off, threatening to rape his wife in front of him. I mean, just awful. And these were millennial kids that were college students.
Right.
I mean, just absurd. And that's what we're coming to. So we need some appropriate security measures. But that being said, we need to get the House back to working for the people. So
Right.
if there's an exemption that Congress qualifies for, you can rest assured that I almost to a T, I will fight to dissolve that.
But I consider security for that. I mean, normal everyday citizens can get security, and they do, whether it's through restraining orders or sometimes provided security, depending on what their situation is and that kind of stuff. So that is just, that's to me, I don't consider that contributing to the class system that exemptions have done, right? Where you mandate that people wear masks or get shots, or do this, but not members of Congress.
Right.
That builds that air of entitlement,
Yep.
right? And like, oh, I'm better than you, and I know more than you because I don't have to follow the rules you do. Which, like you say, goes against hey, if you pass a law or do something like that, what's good for the goose is good for the gander.
Right.
Step up and lead by example, and also have that law applied to you. Absolutely.
I want to say, as it pertains to the vaccine mandate, I think it was like 75% of members of Congress agreed that there should be no mandate. Yet they let the federal government roll out one of the most intrusive and unconstitutional edicts that we've seen in modern times. I mean,
and you have a medical background. I mean, you're 18th century, the equivalent of an 18 Delta. You have been some of the best military medical training there's had, and you're not speaking of this of just like your opinion.
Right.
You're talking about. Yeah, it is. That's an example of where Congress did not keep them in check.
Exactly.
Right? And then just let it go through because they're whatever reason, right? Whether it be lobbyists from the pharmaceutical industry or they're just going along with their party or whatever it is. But yeah, so let's talk about some other current topics and what's going on. So the most recent, the other day, finally the House, after 4 times, elected a speaker. I've been reading into that and kind of how that tit for tat went back and forth. I'm thinking, wow, if Congress wants to lower their image in front of the American people, this was one way they did, especially on the Republican side of you didn't vote for my guy, so when you now I'm not going to vote for your guy. It almost seemed, it almost seemed recess ground, like, right? It's like elementary school. What are your thoughts on how that went? And Johnson, the new House Speaker out of Louisiana, who kind of came out of nowhere.
Yeah.
Not a common name or someone that's been in front of cameras a lot.
So Kevin McCarthy, the former speaker, I give him some credit in the sense that he had a difficult job. There's no denying that. The Republican tent is pretty broad and pretty wide. And there's a huge range of ideals that fall within the Republican camp. And that's not a bad thing. I say that very clearly. Now, I'm very much on the right wing of that. But that being said, we need diverse discussions. We need to have healthy debates. We need to orate. We need to not suppress thought and philosophy. Instead, we need to elevate ones that are effective and actually talk about it in the marketplace of ideals and that kind of exchange. So that being said, the concern over the removal of Speaker McCarthy was over appropriations bills, specifically continuing resolutions and appropriation bills that were not passed on time. I think that the vote to vacate Speaker McCarthy, while controversial and while it created a lot of frustration, was the appropriate decision. Now, there's a lot of people that would find that very offensive, like, oh, but look what happened with the House. True. The House did kind of get into a little bit of chaos. When Speaker Jordan was a potential nominee, I think Mr. Scalise is excellent. I think he's shown himself. He's more of an establishment Republican.
Right.
I don't think he's a bad man, just like I don't think Kevin McCarthy's a bad or an evil man. But I do believe that they made promises and they made negotiations that I'm not willing to make and I'm not willing to support.
Isn't that what politics is about, though? Is negotiating, compromise?
Well, that's what they say. It should be based on principle.
Right.
You're right.
Underladen by principle. But I mean,
yep.
Sometimes you got to give and get a little bit, right?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And so what I think, if Scalise had been the Speaker of the House, as it was anticipated that he would be, I think he would have been an effective speaker. I think there are better options, but I think Mr. Scalise is a good conservative and has some very good things that he's supported. He's certainly a patriot. There's no denying that. I think Mr. Jordan was an even better option. I think, gosh, I mean, what a unique opportunity that would have been to have someone like Jim Jordan, an absolute lion in the House of Representatives, to be Speaker. I thought that was just beyond ideal. Ultimately, the Republican conference decided to remove him from the Speaker vote in a private session vote. I'm not happy with that, but I also understand that that's the decision that was made. So I would have preferred him to have been the Speaker. Having said that, from what I've seen of Mr. Johnson, he seems to be a good man. He seems to be a man of integrity. He seems to be a humble man who merits the divine routinely in his acceptance speech. The first image he posts of after the vote was a picture of the American flag draped with "In God We Trust" above it. Okay, that's a powerful statement.
Yeah.
That's really powerful imagery. And that's a breath of fresh air for the House of Representatives. So I'm praying that he has a successful tenure. I'm praying that God give him wisdom. I pray that he have discernment and partnerships in the right era, but that he strive that healthy balance of good conservative leadership, principled virtue in the House of Representatives, uncompromising in service to the American people. And that
do you think they should keep this? Do you think they should keep this one vote revocation kind of rule in place, or do you think it should take more than just a handful of people to pull someone out because they get mad and don't like what someone does?
Ultimately, I think the one vote is a hot topic. From my perspective, I would rather have more transparency and a bit more chaos than have consolidation. So for example, like a parliament is a much more efficient form of government than a republic, but it comes with a lot of baggage when the coalition government that's formed is very oppressive to what we would consider an infringement on civil liberties. With our republic and the rules that are currently placed on the House with one vote, it creates the potential for chaos, but I actually think that that's a healthy perspective. People should constantly feel that they will be held accountable for their actions if they fail to deliver in a certain capacity. So in my opinion, I don't see that as such a bad thing. One unique characteristic that we find, like for example, in England, someone who becomes the prime minister then ultimately could be revoked. They could give up their seat as prime minister, go back to being an actual member of parliament again, and then potentially someone else would come in and act in their stead. I think that revolving door, while chaotic at times, is not an unjust practice. I think that that's reasonable. So the more members of Congress feel that they have adequate leverage so as to have true selfless leadership, the better. And I think that's a unique way to do it. So overall, I'm not going to say that I'm a hard defender of the one vote rule.
What about like a 10 vote rule, or maybe a 1% rule or something? Still a small number.
5. I've heard some say 10. I've heard some say 20 because it needs to be 10% of the caucus or the conference. I could see that.
I mean, to me, it seems that would be a little bit. I mean, again, it wouldn't be just one person is ticked off and gets a handful of people, because obviously the other side's like we've seen with the Democrats, all voted with that. Right.
I favor traditionally more transparency and an easier method of replacing bad leadership.
Right.
That comes at a consequence. But generally, I favor that perspective.
Yeah. Interesting. So, well, now Mr. Johnson's in place. He's got a heavy road in front of him.
Yep.
We've got a CR that runs out on the 17th of November, and everything else going on. One of those things going on, obviously, is what's been going on in Israel. With your military background, with what you've done with DHS and everything else. I mean, we have just seen. I mean, honestly, it's kind of weird, right? Obviously, we Ukraine for the last year and a half, and now I think most people are like, oh, that's still going on, because everything, they only react to what's in front of them on the TV. But we've got this war in Israel. We've got all the horrific things. I mean, Israel's being, talk about transparency. They're releasing all that Hamas, GoPro footage and showing people, look what really happened, right? Quit going around protesting and acting like Hamas is the victim here. But when you see that what's going on there, and all the and I won't say a lot of anti-Semitism stuff happening in the country, but obviously, it's 80-20 rule or 90-10 rule, right? The people get the cameras look like they represent what's going on. But we see a lot of stuff at universities, discount what the media is doing, but in Hollywood, but our young people coming up, the future leaders of America, and all this kind of stuff. What are your thoughts on some of that? How that's affecting our country, even though it's a war happening over there?
Yeah. I had amazing opportunities to train with the IDF, and I've spoken on Fox News and Newsmax and OAN about my time and experience training with the IDF. They're really remarkable people, remarkable mission set, and just incredible bravery. Having said that, Israel is also in a calculated war that they're not new to. They've been around the block for a good while, and they've seen kind of the rhetoric and the modus operandi of their opponents. This, unfortunately, is all too clear. I think they're prudent. I wish they would release more information. I wish they would release more photographs, more video footage, which is horrific and graphic. But I think the American people and really the international community needs to see the true effect of what some of these radical groups are actually trying to do. Just footage of, I don't want to have people watch videos of real life rape, but I've seen it. I've seen the footage of a woman being gang raped and then executed, and it's awful. I mean, if it doesn't enrage any man who believes in defending the weak and the innocent, I don't know what will. I think that we should see things like that to understand just exactly what the nature of our enemy are. Patton got in huge trouble in Germany after the war. He marched up towns and villages and literally drove them into concentration camps and made them see the living conditions of some of these Jews that were being held. And he got widely rebuked for it. And he said, basically, to hell with y'all. I don't care. They need to see the reality of what they put on this people, because there were so many Germans that were good and decent, but they closed a blind eye,
Right.
and they didn't want to oppress their government with what they knew was happening, but no one wanted to talk about it. Goodness and decency can only occur when there's honesty and integrity, and that can't happen when we have an information vacuum. So
Right.
I think they should release more information. I think we should partner with Israel as a deterrent from other state actors. This is not our conflict, and I don't want to see our boys and girls in the military getting into this war unless it's absolutely essential. However, I do think we should bring a significant degree of military resources to bear in the region so that we can deter organizations like Iran, like Hezbollah in the north, and many others from getting involved.
Well, we've got the Houthi rebels, and we have Iran shooting suicide drones and rockets at our troops in Iraq.
Correct.
In their way. Now, and the report
But
the
they
other day was
respect strength of action. When the Trump administration bombed Soleimani, I was in Cyprus preparing to evacuate the embassy in Lebanon when that was happening, because we were not sure what was going to happen with Iran's reaction. Was Hezbollah going to go off the reservation and just start killing Westerners? We didn't know. It's funny because it took a guy like Trump, who's not the perfect individual, has got a ton of flaws. He had better political intuition with geopolitics than most people. He knew that they would absolutely not respond in kind the way that the world anticipated them.
Well, you know as well as I do, I just mean to cut you off, that dictators, we've seen this all over whether in the Middle East or where else, especially in I'll tell you, Gino, from firsthand experience in the Muslim world, they respect strength. It's the reason why dictators do well. They see kindness as weakness, and they don't adhere to our Western philosophies of negotiation and kindness and all that stuff. There's a reason why Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi, they were oppressive and they were dictators, but people respected that.
Yep.
And Trump kind of came across not evil like they did, but again, Baghdadi, Soleimani, all that stuff was like, oh, you hit something, we come right back at you. They're like, oh, we'll back off, right?
I spent a lot of time overseas before and after the Trump administration, and I will say there was a categorical difference. They may not have quote unquote liked us as much, but man, it was. If we needed any resources for a congressional delegation that was coming into town, if we had an engagement where the vice president was coming in, these nations in the Middle East, they rolled out the red carpet. It was overwhelming the amount of support that they provided to us because they understood this is a powerful broker that it's far better for us to be an ally with than it is for us to be an enemy of.
Again, you may not like your boss or military leader, but you respect him.
They absolutely respected the Trump administration because, and you had guys like Mike Pompeo that came out there as Secretary of State. He's a hard negotiator. Before we did anything with North Korea, said, nope, you will return all the remains you have of U.S. troops before we even sit down at the table. And they did. They capitulated. I mean, amazing efforts, that were made. That's what we needed. Diplomacy should be the velvet glove that wraps the iron fist. We're missing the iron fist.
That's nice. I like that.
We don't have. We have all the velvet, but we got none of the iron that backs it anymore, and that's the problem. We need to develop a spine and a backbone. And I've worked overseas with members of the U.S. State Department and many other federal agencies, and just watched them obliterate and embarrass this nation in front of European Union representatives, NATO, you name it, the United Nations, in just a way that's abysmal. I've seen American diplomats talk about America's sexist and racist and awful, and on official government dime, on an official government event, and I'm just sitting here thinking, it's no wonder the world doesn't respect us.
Right. You're not even airing true dirty laundry. You're talking bad about yourself and all that stuff. They're not going to do that about their own nation.
No. Right? Whereas when we interact with nations who are reserved, who are responsive, who have integrity, who fulfill their obligations, an example of this was in Afghanistan. We were at an outpost where we had a lot of we had a big relationship with a local farmer, and he would supply a lot of the food that we would have on our base, and we'd feed this small militia of Afghans that we trained up. They were recognized under the Afghan National Army. Great, amazing guys.
Was that ASG guy? Were that the ASGs?
So they were, we called them the Vipers, but they were like a Afghani commando force.
Yep.
Really just amazing guys. And so worked incredibly hard. I mean, they loved it because we paid them well. We treated them like human beings. We were decent to them, but we were also honest and fair. It was a true meritocracy. Didn't matter what clan or tribe they came from. If they worked hard, they'd progress in rank. They loved that honesty and sincerity. But we were getting ripped off by this local business owner to the south of us, and the Afghanis knew it. Well, one of the individuals who was in charge of the finances of this base said, yeah, I mean, we're paying for 500 pounds of this food product, but we're only getting 400 pounds. So our response was, well, why don't we just tell them next time you deliver 600 pounds, or we sever the contract and make up for what he's shorted us. And their response was, well, that's just not how things work here. And I said, you're right, because you look like a sucker that can be easily duped. And if you start actually holding a hard line, people will respect you more. You'll have better relationships and partnerships. People will want to work with the American government because we mean business and we mean what we say. If you're looked at like a prostitute, like someone who's just, you're gonna do something for very cheap or very little, or that the American government is just an organization you come to and you sell your stuff to and they give you a bunch of money, that's not enfranchising respect. That's not building relationships and rapport. That's teaching people that we're a foreign entity that just has money. That's no way to win a conflict. That's no way to win the hearts and minds of the Afghan people. The early special forces soldiers and also special operations troops that were in Afghanistan when the war first started was very different. They meant business. They were not there to placate and play nice. They were there to do a job. They said, help us, we'll reward you. Get in our way, we're going to fight you. And it was very simple.
Yeah.
And a lot of Afghanis came through the woodwork to help the American forces early on. That's what we need in government. We need people to actually do what they say.
Well, Jason Amarine was the team commander of ODA 574 that brought Karzai in. And I've talked to him many times, like, dude, why don't you get in politics? He's in the area and that kind of stuff. But I just like, you need to be stepping up and getting into that. I mean, but he literally is the one that just wreaked havoc in the South and brought Karzai in there and got him in country. But you're right. Those are the kind of folks we need. They know what it takes to negotiate. We talked about earlier about negotiating, compromising. But you underlie that, you have principle underneath that, right? And you got to just know what you can give on. But yeah, we definitely need that. What is your thoughts about just some of this anti-Semitism, these marches, tearing down the posters in this country? Does that give you? Do you look at that and go, "Oh man, our future's like we're never. What's going to happen to us?" Or do you look at it? That's just such a small minority that are just reacting to what seems cool on TikTok.
Well, unfortunately, I don't think a lot of these people are really principled in their positions. I think they've been indoctrinated. It shouldn't be a surprise. When my father used to talk to me as a kid saying, Cameron, you watch, one day when you're a man, you're going to see people outspokenly defending communism in the public square. You're going to see universities inculcated with people who are so radically progressive that they believe the United States should be destroyed. And when you're a child, you hear this and you think, oh gosh, this is like some utopian future that I hope I never see. My father was spot on. I have to give him a ton of credit. And there were a lot of people warning us in the 80s. Hey, we're headed in a very dangerous direction, and the progressive influence in schools will have lasting consequences. And so what we're seeing now is exactly that. I think we have an entire generation that doesn't understand the nature of international conflict, that doesn't have an appropriate grasp on history, and that have been frankly indoctrinated into some of the most reprehensible practices in the world. People forget that Nazis were socialists. The National Socialist Workers Party.
Yep.
So socialism has created some of the most egregious acts of violence and malevolence that the world has ever seen. And so I think people need to wake up and realize just what it is that we're advocating for. This anti-Semitism is all too common. And for the Jewish community, it's still astonishing that you have some very progressive Jewish families that still promote and promulgate this kind of activity and environment in a way that's just astonishing to see as someone who believes in God firmly. So look, what's going on in these schools has to be outspoken and rebuked. We need to see universities actually step up saying we support diverse thought and theory in public debates, but we will not stand by this reprehensible defense of the most inhumane actions known to man: rape, murder. I mean, just some of the most awful
torture. Yeah.
Torture.
What's more concerning? I mean, I look at it and go, what's more concerning to me? That we have universities and college kids who are just being led astray and don't know any better that are out there doing this, or that we have elected representatives in Congress that are espousing the same stuff, that are saying the same things and are doubling and tripling down on it. And
I've heard the argument of some that they have concerns over the civilians in Gaza and in the West Bank because of groups like Hamas or Hezbollah or many others, and the PLO and the Palestinian Authority with what they've done. That's all legitimate. And I think we should certainly be concerned for the well-being of innocent bystanders. At the same time, though, we cannot be wavering in any way that some of these masochistic evildoers have to be destroyed. These are not people that you're willing to negotiate. These aren't just kids that found a bad way and they just need the right direction. No. I'm sorry, when you gang rape a 17-year-old girl, behead her, and leave her body in the street in southern Syria, I don't think that's a redeemable form of behavior. I'm sorry. I don't think that's a person that just, if we just gave them the right education and the chance to thrive and a better economy, things would be better for them. No, this is evil. We have to destroy evil. And one thing that I will say, the evangelical community has been, it's coming awake now, which is good. But for years, the evangelical community was silent on rejoicing when evil fails. When evil is destroyed and vanquished, we should rejoice and celebrate. When Osama bin Laden was killed, it's amazing that we saw people celebrating in the streets. I think that's a great thing.
Yeah.
But we should have had people celebrating all throughout the United States that one of the most evil and despicable men that the modern era has seen was destroyed.
And when Saddam Hussein was captured.
Bingo.
Same thing.
We should be celebrating because we should rejoice in the triumph of goodness over evil. So what's going on now is an example in these schools. It's an example of teaching people and incentivizing victimhood, victimization, and radical behavior for what? For attention and power. So, like, really, what's the goal here? Why are we spinning these kids up and making them turn out into little Maoists? It's because some of the school protests that we saw earlier on, there's a book called what is it? The Coddling of the American Mind. It's a really interesting book that talks about this downward slide that we've seen within the educational institutions and how school groups and students have become exceedingly radical. For what purpose? To gain authority and influence on programs within the school itself. It's authoritarian based. That's all it is. At the end of the day, this isn't about raising awareness for an issue. It was all about having power and influence. And I think we need to be very clear and sober minded. What are we seeing in schools right now? We are seeing radically progressive ideology infiltrate and inculcate the minds of these youth for what? To be maneuvered and wound up for influence, power, and control
of whoever's funding and behind us. I mean, they don't know why they're doing it. They're just getting spun up by the right. This is no different than what we've seen in Korea, where North Korean infiltrators and propagandists would infiltrate the South Korean colleges and have all those college. And this was, back in my days in the 80s and 90s, and they were protesting and going against the government. And they thought, it was all being fed by North Korean intelligence agencies and that kind of stuff. And we've seen that across the board, a number of countries where, there's someone behind it who gets people stirred up, feeds. I mean, some people would say even in the 60s, right? In the 60s and the anti-Vietnam War movement and all the stuff that happened on universities. Granted, they probably had a little bit more skin because they were worried about getting drafted and didn't want to go to war, but there was still a lot of stuff, funding and things behind that were getting them all worked up to be anti-US. And in my opinion, you talked about this downward slide. It really, to me, came out of that time frame. It came out of the 60s and 70s, went quiet and underground for a later part of the 70s, and then early part of the 80s, and then started climbing its way back up.
People forget that during the 60s and 70s, we had card-carrying communists who hid their affiliation with the Communist Party and then accepted high-ranking positions within the federal government.
We had elected members in our Congress that were, KKK members.
Correct.
Right? So, I mean, there was definitely, but you didn't have the transparency and the cameras running 24/7 that people were aware of that. They just watched their 6:00 news on the three mains, and that was it. Hey, one more thing I want to get on, then I want to let you go because you've done 2 great episodes with me. This is as the time of this recording, this is still ongoing. We've got this terrible, mass shooting in Maine, which is interesting from a lot of aspects. We've seen, I'm seeing a few commonalities with it as far as some mental health issues and that kind of stuff. And all the recent, I would say, last 2 years of mass shootings, right? They've I think almost every one of them have had mental issues. A number of them have had transgender confusion issues, but a majority of them have been younger people. High school, college age, that kind of stuff. Here we have someone in their 40s, apparently a Army reservist, potentially with mental issues, self-proclaimed, but has an AR, took a weapon, and obviously, latest count was 22 people, upwards from 30 to 60 wounded. But I mean, what are your thoughts on this? What is, obviously this is going to feed one side's, anti-gun rhetoric, but, and we know that's coming from the first moment of the first shot, right? We know, okay, here it comes. But what are your thoughts on this, on what this means to this country? And is this going to be just a 15-minute blip, or is there's something really going to be done or with mental health in this country?
Yeah, ultimately, we have a mental health epidemic in this nation that is astonishing. It's unlike anything that I think I've ever seen. It's far more egregious than I ever expected it would be. So we've also kind of, when we see people as capable of of goodness and also capable of evil, I think we have a much healthier perspective on the world. When we blame inanimate objects or tools of war, weapons of war, for the calamities of war, we really we perpetuate an environment in a world that I don't want to be associated with, where no one can be held to account for the actions it's not the actions of the firearm itself. It's the individual pulling the trigger that did it.
Right.
And there are various means to do it, whether it's with a knife, with a gun,
With a
so
car.
That's my argument or a car,
right.
An airplane, like we saw in 9/11. Ultimately, we have to hold people responsible for actions, not inanimate objects. So that's number one. And that's just an easy way, I think, to diffuse the argument, which is not what the political left wants to do. And I recognize that. The fact is, though, it's human behavior that we're trying to tamponade off, not inanimate items itself. And so that's the only way we're going to fix these problems. Number two, we are seeing examples of, in this nation, people becoming completely unraveled at the smallest things. We have mental health, which is not appropriately understood. We are not empowering physicians and families to be as motivated to engage with loved ones that we know have serious mental health problems and need help, need assistance, and they're not getting it properly. We put continuous restrictions on physicians being able to actually put people in institutions for observation. Now, that's a very difficult balance to strike, because you are talking about restraining someone's rights and putting them in an institution potentially against their will. It's a very slippery slope to go down.
How does that balance with the enabling of physicians to enact red flag laws?
Well, that's the other. Red flag laws are unconstitutional because they're using a
they're focusing on an inanimate object.
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
Yeah.
So we need to flag human behavior, not objects themselves.
Yeah.
So when it comes to the red flag laws, that's an actual infringement on people's civil liberties. To do that, you need to go before a magistrate. You need to go before a judge. You need to go and be a part of our judicial system to restrain. And that's what a law enforcement officer is trained to do. When they arrest you, they're restraining your rights. They're effectively causing you to have to either willingly or unwillingly surrender yourself and surrender your agency to be taken into detention, to then undergo this judicial process to determine if you have criminal wrongdoing, and i.e., are you culpable for action where there's perceived damages, either through prosecution and or incarceration or financial compensation, things like that. That's a very, very sobering reality. So that's also why I want people to be heavily invested. Who's your local sheriff? Because that is the most powerful constitutional officer in your county, period. Who's your Commonwealth attorney, here in Virginia, or who's your state attorney? These are powerful offices that we need to really understand what's their philosophy on life, because that will impact their decisions while using those authorities. So what's going on with these shootings is awful. I could never defend them in any way. We really need to come to grips with understanding that we're not empowering people now to be to have the compensating mechanisms needed for difficult times. When people feel like there's no alternative solution other than shooting a bunch of folks, that's a prime example of someone that was not given healthy coping mechanisms to deal with stress, to deal with anxiety, to deal with conflict, with substance abuse, all those things.
Well, we'll learn more from coming. I mean,
Yeah.
I live right up the road from where the Buffalo grocery store shooting happened. Right, that was very close to me and what it meant. But obviously, we look at Uvalde, we look at Nashville, we look at Parkland, all these different shootings, and so far in every single one of them, what would be considered red flags had popped. Right, people ignored it. Sometimes parents even condone their activity, and it looks like for this case it may be the same. But these control measures and mitigation measures are in place, but they were not being used or even followed up on or exercised, which to me makes someone just as responsible. Right, if a local law enforcement doesn't follow up or warn somebody, if parents see activity, like in the Buffalo shooting, the kid threatens to shoot up his high school graduation, yet they still buy him a gun within a year later.
Exactly.
It's like there's accountability there. You might as well have pulled the trigger, right? It's a person
family made a huge disservice with that decision. And I have a saying that I like to use: as go families, so go the nation. We need stronger families in this nation. That is one of the only coping mechanisms we have, because families are united in faith, they're united in practice. They are your coping mechanism for difficult times. People talk about, I got fired, I had this happen, I got injured. What do you think of? You want to go to mom, you want to go to family, you want to go, and who genuinely are willing to influence you so that you can thrive.
Right.
even in a way that you don't like and appreciate. Some of the greatest points of human change are when a father sits a child down saying, look, son, let me steer you in the right direction here. It's not what you want to hear, but it's what you need to hear. And then
Right.
later you hear people saying, I'm so grateful my father told me that. I'm so grateful he invested in me and told me you can do so much more than you've been doing. When we lie to our children, when we tell them, that was the best you could do.
When we
How
give them that
utterly like
trophy for losing, yes.
how awful is it to tell a child that mediocre performance is the best that they can do? That's incredibly psychologically damaging, actually.
Yeah.
When you say, hey, you did well, you did good, I'm going to reward you here, but here's how you can get better. When we're honest with them, when we show them that there's a pathway to succeed, and then you give them the tools to do it, man, that's true empowerment. And that's exactly what God would have us do in this world, in my opinion, to build one another up so as to restore the position that Christ has called them in. So ultimately,
The woke cancel culture though goes against that, right?
it
That
totally
it is
does. And that's a
180
problem.
degrees from that. Yes.
So we need strong families to deal with these serious cultural problems. We see that in sexual promiscuity. We see it in drug use. We see it in mental health. At the end of the day, we need stronger families to bind together and to help be a coping mechanism and infrastructure to mitigate these huge problems that are growing in our culture.
We talked about it before, right? The national elections, the national political scene are really influenced and need to start it down at the school board and the local level. The same as what's happening in this country. Like you
100%.
said, it needs to start in the house,
Yep.
right? Even before they go to that school, right? We should not be depending on teachers to raise our, better not depend on teachers to raise our kids, because we see where that's going, right? Teachers at any level, but they need to have, it's not a daycare. You don't drop them off. You need to be involved with your kids.
Right.
You need to understand what they're learning. And all this stuff. I think that's the one good thing that came out of 2020 and the lockdown was it seemed that when the parents were stuck at home and the kids were stuck at home, a lot of parents started hearing things in those Zoom calls that made them like raise their eyebrows and look like, wait, what are they being taught? Because they had just ignored it. How was your school day? Oh, it's fine, whatever. We didn't do nothing. And that's all they ever heard. Right. Now they started hearing what was being told to their kids and they started going, wait. And I think that's what happened in Virginia, right? People were going, wait, what? What are you being taught? Oh, not on my watch, right? I think that's probably the only good thing that came out of that whole lockdown.
Yeah, you're spot on.
Yeah, it was something. Hey, I told you one last thing. I do have one more thing because it is something you're close to, being at DHS and everything else. That and this is one of your top 3 priorities, and that's the southern border. I know I'm just hitting you with all kind of fuzzy topics, but what's we see what's going on. Again, cameras aren't focused there right now. They're focused on a lot of other stuff, and makes people that live in the 5-minute news cycles just forget about it. But obviously we're seeing the numbers. I saw them the other day. I didn't have them handy, but the number of watch list terrorist watch lists that have come across that border is now, this year, in the year's not over, has blown past anywhere else. We're seeing, I saw a report the other day that Mexican nationals are now the minority coming across the border. They are not the number one anymore.
Oh yeah.
What
I can say about the southern border is that whatever you see on the news.
Hold on, my video is frozen. If I drop, I'll be back. I don't know what I did. You keep going, but just so you know, this happened the other day too.
No worries. What I can tell people is that whatever you see on the southern border, it is so much worse. Whatever the news and the media is showing you, it is so much worse. And that's a really unfortunate reality that we have to contend with. Our southern border is not secure. I don't care what anyone says. And so we really need to come to grips with the amount of money and resources that we are spending on worsening a problem by creating huge incentives and reward systems for people to come into this country illegally, to violate our national sovereignty, and then do so while receiving public assistance. It's not sustainable, and it's absolutely not in the best interest of the American people.
Yeah. It's like most things in the world, right? The news is only giving you about 10% of what really how bad it is, and
it is so much worse. So people saw Sound of Freedom. If you saw that movie, it's really compelling. It's worse now. It's so much worse now.
That's it's something I hope the American people don't shift their eyes off of, with everything else going on in Ukraine and Israel and everything else in our country and DC. I mean, our country is being overtaken.
Yeah, I tell people that but also at the southern border, there's an entire industry of individuals on the southern border that are preying on human beings and benevolence and making just money hand over fist. It has turned into a humanitarian catastrophe. I mean, a third of every woman that comes across the southern border, some of our estimates are a third of every woman are sexually assaulted somewhere on the way. You have parents that are so desperate to send their kids, they just think, there's many places all through Central and South America, even other parts of the world, that they just think, if I just spend enough money and get my kids to the United States, they're just going to have a better life than what they have here.
And they send their kids up.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
2022, we had 125,000 unaccompanied minors. Those are just the unaccompanied ones. So a moral nation would not continue this.
Who are also being sexually abused and stuff.
Oh my gosh.
Boys and girls both.
And exploited.
Yes, and exploited, put into human trafficking and yeah. Yeah. It's
so I argue that we have amazing people working at the southern border, but these practices are absolutely not sustainable and they're not humanitarian.
Yeah. Yeah. It is I'm glad our video, hopefully you can see me okay. Our video look like
that's in no way an attack on people of Border Patrol or Customs and Border Protection.
I can't with their job.
They are doing an unbelievable job with limited to no resources in a way, like every day the morale of those organizations are in the absolute gutter.
I can't imagine how low it is. It's got to be low. I mean, when they think it's at the bottom. Yeah, when it's at the bottom, it's got to even go lower. Yep. I mean, and then they see Mayorkas and others come in and do their little tour and just, I mean, I can imagine
stopped doing that because he started getting chewed out publicly.
Yeah, they didn't care anymore. They weren't gonna listen to whatever the supervisors were saying. Don't say this or do this. They were gonna do it.
Yep.
But yeah, so it is. I'm glad that's one of your top 3 priorities. And again, for working at DHS as you did. You've got firsthand insight into that, and that's another one that our American people need to wake up. It has nothing to do with left and right. It has nothing to do with any of that other stuff, right? It's just these people are coming over here, and then they have nowhere. And so Abbott did a great thing. He made it a national issue by busing and flying, and him and DeSantis flying people all over, because everyone else was kind of, that's not my problem. So I live in the state of New York, unfortunately, and Adams got them all in New York City, which is by law on the New York City law. They have to take in people, right? They don't even have a choice. But then he did what he criticized Abbott of, and he has bussed them around the state. One of them is right near my house. They're sitting in a Red Roof Inn, not far from my house, for a year, paid for and fed by the city of New York. That runs out in June. And all I keep asking is, and they have National Guard there now watching because they've been having rapes and assaults, and they have private security there at this little, motel. And what happens in June? How are they going to kick those people out? Right? They're just going to willingly just walk out and just like they don't work, they don't have money, they don't have food. They're not going to leave. The local PD is going to be in riot gear trying to push them out because they're not just going to give up and leave. And New York City probably isn't going to pay for them beyond that time. Right. No, all they've done is kick it down the road. No one thought about where all these people that are even temporarily settled and compensated for, where they're going to go.
And they're being told, a lot of them are being told, if you just say the right things and you work through the system, you're going to have resources, you're going to get financial assistance when you get there.
Right.
And they're not wrong.
Right.
So there is an incentive to do this.
That's that entitlement we talked about, right?
We have to crush it. We have to eliminate that.
With that, and not having voter reform and voter ID, and obviously, I mean, some people say, "Oh, you're thinking too far right" or whatever conspiracies. Like, they're bringing voters in, right? Why would you not if you're given a chance?
I had a German exchange student stay with my family when I was a high school kid in California. He was sent an absentee ballot
in California.
In California,
and that was a few years ago.
That was a while ago. He was sent an absentee ballot when he got his driver's license. He was a German citizen.
Yes.
Not an American citizen.
So this is not something new. Yeah, this is not.
He was sent an absentee ballot in 2004.
Wow.
Great guy. I mean, I love the guy. He was awesome, but he was sent an absentee ballot. Not a voter registration form, an absentee ballot.
Like he was already registered.
Oh, he was already registered and signed up to receive an absentee ballot.
Yeah. That's something.
Came to my house. My father called me. It's like, what the hell is this?
Yeah. Well, hey, thank you so much, Cameron. You've done a couple great episodes with me, man. I really appreciate it. It's been great talking to you and getting to know you. And I hope all of our viewers and listeners enjoyed it too. I'm sure they will. Our paths may be crossing sometime soon. We were talking about that earlier. I hope they get a chance to. I'm down in your neck of the woods actually quite a bit with my work. So I plan for us to meet face to face one day and give you a hug. And man, I'm so awesome. It's so awesome to watch what you're doing. And I'm going to be just watching with bated breath as you go through this process over the next year. You're right. It's not going to be easy. It's all uphill, but I know you're going to ruck up and change your socks, take some Motrin, and just keep putting one foot in front of the other.
That's a good way to put it. Yep.
There you go. All right. Cameron, thank you so much for joining us and coming on. And I hope everyone checks you out at CameronHamilton.com, watches that YouTube video, gets to know you and your family, read what you're about. And I hope people, even if they don't live in District 7, I'm sure you could use any support you can get, and
Absolutely.
it'd be greatly appreciated. Hey,
absolutely.
Thanks so much, bro. Thank you, brother. Same thing. You too, man. Have a good one. Well, that wraps up another episode of the Stew and the Nunn Show, and we hope you had as much fun listening to it as we did hosting it for you. Don't forget to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter. You can find all these links at stewandthenunn.com. We will talk to you again next Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Central. Also, we'd like to thank our sponsors, Commodity Outdoors, Veteran Outdoors, and Listen 9 Fight Company.